Pike, and his talk is about researcher Penn Jones Jr. And Chris Pike has contributed materials to the JFK material collection at Baylor University Pogue Library. He's an independent researcher into early critic of the Warren Commission, Penn Jones Jr., and also on Operation Northwoods. His presentation on Penn Jones has an emphasis on his deep concerns for the corporate media takeover, the consolidation of the military-industrial corporations, the marginalization of the chief executive's role in the federal government, and as well as how the research community evolved from Penn's contributions, which are being ignored by history. So, Chris Pike, I think he has a slideshow too he's covering.
Trying to get going here. We got that set.
Get the light.
So just see you later, John. Thank you. See you out there, maybe.
Thanks. I can show you what the name of the slideshow is.
This one, present.
Yeah, that's right.
That's his presentation.
Thank you.
You're welcome to say some things tomorrow if you want to.
Robert, don't leave. I want to include you in my thank yous.
Chris,
Stick around. You have to go back to work.
I have to go to work.
Keep at it. Keep at
We
it.
come to pause later?
Yeah, yeah.
Great. And thanks for all your help through the years.
Thank you.
Bob makes some sales, man. Be up in a minute.
Oh, there it is. All right. Thank goodness.
Yeah, get a new computer.
No, it's one that's going to be thrown away. I'm going to Macintosh after this weekend, I swear, on my mother's soul. I'm never going to use Microsoft technology again. My name's Chris Pike. We have some wonderful
Someone get the light?
topics this weekend, but the one that kind of slips by, and I'll just tell you to click it or push for the next slide. All right, there's Mr. Penn Jones, Brigadier General Penn Jones. My presentation today is about what went on here in Dallas. Want me to move a little bit?
Yeah.
Sure. What went on in here in Dallas, unbeknownst to the press generally, or if the press was informed or goaded by Penn Jones, most of us as researchers have probably not been aware of that. He was probably the biggest protagonist, if I may use the word, and antagonist to the power structures of Dallas, but protagonist for a new investigation. So this picture taken by John Howard Griffin is pretty good example. You can see a lot in this character in this image. I'm basically here today to give a eulogy, though. Not to America, which deserves one, but seriously to Rusty Rhodes, George William Rusty Rhodes. Rusty was living in Dallas as a young kid when the assassination occurred. He was actually just finishing high school, and he had, there he is, had an exposure to the social structure of Dallas. His father, Bill Rhodes, knew Jack Ruby. His uncle was a prominent district attorney. Rusty seemed to be able to come in contact just by being a member of this Rhodes family with some very interesting people, including the Campisi family, where he did some babysitting. So when he encountered Penn Jones in the late 60s, traumatized Rusty was by the assassination, by he met one of the doctors who was just distraught. It was about a month after the assassination, and they were, of course, as you know from your research, told not to discuss the details of the emergency surgeries or any of those things. So Rusty was quickly drawn to Penn Jones. Can we click the next slide? I'll show you what. Okay. Jones was here in Daley Plaza after he was at the Trade Mart and the president did not arrive. He came back to Parkland. He came to the plaza, this is about 2 o'clock, and took pictures which now reveal as we know, why these cars are there. The Dallas police cars were parked over some mark on the sidewalk from a bullet that went past the limo and struck the sidewalk. At least that's the ongoing theory or position of many researchers. I tend to believe it. This shot here, Jones shot at Parkland. He was taking pictures all over the place. And that's Jack Ruby. According to Eva Grant, Jack Ruby's sister. And that was the first ripple that maybe Ruby was an operative in the plaza that day and not just a disgruntled bar owner or police pimp, as Penn also characterized him. But that was Jack Ruby as identified by his sister. So Jones was totally engaged in this case. Next clip. And he went about gathering information about mysterious deaths and disappearances. And his volumes 1 through 4, Forgive My Grief, are essentially compilations of information he was able to get from the public record, from tips, from phone calls. And those mysterious deaths were just astounding to him. They were from all over the place. I can't even take the time today to go through the whole litany of mysterious deaths and disappearances, but believe me, he was tracking it more than anyone else. And this is Penn in the 80s, I believe, there to give a moment of silence. Well, the moment of silence, I want you all to know, Dallas wanted, for obvious reasons, wanted to forget about the assassination or the anniversary, and so in 1971, I found a picture in the archives of the Midlothian Mirror, Penn's newspaper in Midlothian, that showed one person at 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 1971. The picture was taken from the overpass. So he vowed, not long afterwards, maybe it was even before 71, to have the moment of silence. But anyway, he had a picture there that year which showed no one there. So the moment of silence is originated by Penn Jones. We should all be grateful for this man who cared so much and was brokenhearted at the military, as he saw it, a military takeover of the United States at that time. Here's a nice quote I put in here. We can stand up and take it or get on our knees, but I'll be biting on the way down. I mean, wonderful quotes. He just despised the military. He felt that they had taken over the country, and as in fact we now know that the CIA and the military have had bases all over the world. If you study more and more about foreign policy and the like, you realize that we've been going through this process of empire building for over a century. And so when Kennedy came along, he was going against the grain, and we all know what happened. This was part of Jones' life in the military. He liberated Buchenwald with his arm, the 5th Army, I believe it was, 36th Division, Texas Division. He was right there when Hermann Goring had surrendered, and so he took this picture. And he was appalled by fascism, and he vowed when he left the military in 1946 that he would start his own newspaper and his own soapbox. So he bought the Midlothian Mirror for $4,000, and with an old linotype machine that he just about died trying to make work. And finally figured out it. You melt lead, you make the keys and all this stuff. So you just go back to Rusty. You can just keep clicking back till we get to him again. There we go. Thanks. Long and the short, I want to give you a few pieces of information. Rusty Rhodes, who died at the age of 62 on September 26th, 2010, he was going to be here and he was going to say a few words, and I had to goad him a little bit because he'd given up on this case. He worked so hard he burned out by the time the House Select Committee went ahead to investigate, and what a tumultuous affair that was, with the change of leadership, the firing of Henry Gonzalez, who sponsored HB 204, and so he worked very hard and then burned out, frankly, just from doing an average of 4 presentations on the forensics and the ballistics and the whole assassination lecture about what in those days gave evidence of more than one assassin. One of the individuals who worked with Rusty in California is here today, and his name is Terry Fraze. He's sitting in the front seat, and I won't ask him to stand, but we are indebted to people like Terry and Robert Groden and many others who knew Penn Jones, who inspired many. Jones, for free, took people on tours to where all the different events occurred, the Tippit assassination, the killing of Oswald in the basement, and all these different things. not to be taken for granted today. You know, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of uncertainty about whether this case could ever be retried. Along came Jim Garrison in New Orleans, and we now know how difficult and Herculean his effort was to prosecute and convict several people, really, but he ended up just through elimination of witnesses along the way. He ended up with Clay Shaw, a tough one to prove. David Ferry was a prime suspect, and on down the litany. I think most of you are familiar with that. Rhodes was executive director of the Committee to Investigate Political Assassinations. He spearheaded the drive for H.R. 204, the historic legislation of 1976. The author of House Rule 204, House Rule, should be a House Bill, Congressman Henry B. Gonzalez, made note of these efforts when he told the Washington, D.C. media back in the 70s, quote, "It's Mr. Rhodes and this organization that is responsible for the passage of H.R. 204. Now, we have a lot of people to thank, including Robert Groden, for getting out on Geraldo Rivera's show in April of '75 for us to see the Zapruder film. But my goodness, don't forget, it took a lot of work to get signatures on petitions. It wasn't necessarily just the images of the Zapruder film on television that moved our politicians in Washington to go forward with an investigation. It took pressure on the ground, in the field, from people like Rusty, who was showing the slides and doing all these different arguments, counter and counterpoint, whether there was a conspiracy. Throughout the 1970s, then, Mr. Rhodes appeared at hundreds of colleges and universities throughout the country. Attendance records were broken, and second shows were added to accommodate the overflowing crowds. Such as the strength of the presentation and its message, Mr. Rhodes taught the first accredited class on the assassination of JFK at Santa Monica College in 1969. He knew Roger Craig. You know, he learned, and Roger Craig, if you don't know, some of you, Roger was Bill Decker's deputy sheriff, and he was rookie. As a rookie, I believe he was under sheriff or deputy sheriff of the year for Dallas, and he was here in the plaza. He was instructed not to provide security, but just to observe the president going by the Dallas Sheriff's Office, which is in the old building. What's that building? Come on, Ladon.
Criminal Courts Building.
Criminal Courts Building. Thank you. And so there was Roger, and he heard the shots, and he immediately ran towards the plaza. And there's a whole presentation I could give you just on the importance and role of Roger Craig. But essentially, Roger's testimony to the Warren Commission was altered. He befriended Penn Jones. Penn provided sanctuary, encouragement, money, an automobile, anything Penn could give Roger to continue going public with his position that the Warren Commission was defrauding his testimony and defrauding the testimony of other people. So the long and the short is that Rusty was involved with all these people, and there was a lot of anger and indignation at that time, a lot of fear. The title of his presentation in the 70s was "A Decade of Conspiracy from Dallas to the Watergate." And give you a few more pieces of information here. I wanted to make this fairly short because you get the point, but let me give you some of the details of just about what it was like. Here, for example, he had a press conference with Robert Groden in mid-1975. I'm still researching through his papers to figure out what date it was, but at that time they announced that H.R. 204 was going to vote and would likely be passed by a majority for authorization of $6 million in funds for this investigation. That was a high point in Rusty's life because he went all over the country. He went to several hundred audiences, colleges, universities, high school classes, whatever. And the people at that time were intensely interested. They called him standing room only at Rhodes because there was so much interest that people, well, like here, had to stand outside in some cases and to get a hear. And so they'd reschedule the lecture for more. There was just too many people who wanted to know. So he would say, he wrote, and this is to the author Wachensky of the Class of '65. There's a whole chapter about Rusty in that book, the Class of '65. Quote, we'd go down to town for free, we'd rent the local hall, do all the build-up with the radio and TV people, have the lecture, and stay in town for several days afterwards. Then we would try to leave a small support structure that could continue after we were gone. We'd give them a copy of the Zapruder film of the assassination that shows Kennedy getting shot from back and front. We'd supply them with fact sheets and an organizer's manual. It was a beautiful thing watching this direct democratic process work. We'd pick up votes by the week just by targeting districts. So you see the intricacies of this, and recall that Penn Jones was brokenhearted about what happened in Daley Plaza in 1963, and he believed that democracy had died that day. His devout pessimism, I think, served as a catalyst for some, not so faint of heart, like Rusty Rhodes, who countered and thought, well, wait a minute, we're not going to give up on this. The military is all powerful at this time in our country's history, but that doesn't mean we can't use the civilian processes. And I think that has to be emphasized. You know, we're getting into this whole different world now in which we have everything handed to us in our hand, literally, whether it's a computer device, what have you, but a telephone, that's a computer. My goodness, they use mimeograph copying and the radio extensively, handouts, brochures. It was a different world then, really, and I think we have to recognize that those basics still apply. It was, quote, it was painstaking work to isolate and obtain access to meet with senators and representatives. I would call Gail Beagle, and that was Henry Gonzalez's secretary or administrative assistant. He had a seat in Henry's office. That's how important Rusty was to Henry Gonzalez. And Gonzalez would get a representative, a congressman in Illinois, for example, and then float a deal so I'd be able to lecture out there. I rented halls and worked the radio like crazy, and people came out. Like I said, he was told wherever he went that the system isn't working anymore. The system doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, right. When told that there was nothing that could be done, that there was no hope regarding stopping the war or going after the conspirators in the JFK assassination, I emphasize the need to work within the system. There are federal buildings everywhere to prove the existence of the system. So this is what he told me back in '08. He was frankly discouraged about these conferences. He wasn't really apprised of what went on in these conferences. I gave him short little pieces of summaries, and it was hard for him to understand. Almost out, huh?
Pass.
Okay. And yet, these conferences continue. The information continues to come out. And we just owe a debt of gratitude to Penn Jones, Robert Groden, Terry Fraze right here. Terry, would you stand up for a moment, please, and just say hello. Thank you. That is all I have, but I just want you to all understand the perspective of the past and how we can use some of those same techniques and fortitude to continue on, and maybe someday there'll be another investigation. Thank you very much for your time. Did you have a question?
When did Rusty Rhodes burn out?
About 1976. He went ahead and worked for a private investigative firm, and he did some very dynamic work in the last years of the 70s. But as far as the Kennedy case goes, he was doing the same presentation 3 or 4 times a week for 2.5 years. So it was just more than he could handle. So he just went on to doing private investigating. And there's a whole other story I can't tell today about what he did as a PI on the Howard Hughes will, on the Sudanese Liberation Army, on and on and on. He was a fascinating investigator. Anybody else?
I want to ask one more thing.
Sure.
I saw Rusty Rhodes in Northern
Carson can't do it.
I'm there?
Sent us a
Yeah.
video up here.
And I have a,
Just pre-recorded, that's what
brought
he
with
wants
me,
to do.
it's a petition.
So it's like 15 minutes.
We have signed.
Sent it
open
to
new
email, so we're going to check and see if we got it.
Oh, fantastic.
I found it.
He said no, he's not, sir. I heard somebody talk
Oh, that's fantastic.
Want to see that?
last week.
I'd love to. Anybody else have questions?
He seemed really good.
Yes, sir.
Let me just add, I have a picture that I took of Penn Jones with Senator Ralph Yarborough at Daley Plaza. You'll see it on the front page of a Yahoo group that I run called Dallas JFK Research. If you ask for permission to get on there and look at these links to articles and so forth, the research I have.
I'll have a look. What's your name, sir?
I'm Tom Blackwell.
Oh, Tom Blackwell, right. You've sent me emails forever. Okay.
You're probably on that list or directly on the
Yeah.
email list. For those of you who may not be, that's available. But that picture of Ralph Yarborough and Penn Jones on the front of this, at the heading of this Yahoo group, is available at this time.
Yeah, Penn was an abiding, unrepentant, unrelenting Democrat, one of few. And in Texas, I think there were only 2 liberal dailies in the whole state, and Penn was one of the 2. Okay, anybody else? That's it? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris.